Well, in 1994, we had a different type of football team here in Nebraska. I don't know how it works out that whenever I'm using them as an illustration, it always happens after a terrible loss. But you'll remember back then, Tom Osborne had not yet won a national championship, and they were playing Miami in Miami at the Orange Bowl. And they were down 10-7 at halftime. And really, Coach Osborne's speech at halftime is legendary. After talking to his team about staying at it and putting pressure on them, and that if they did, they would wear them down, and that it would work out for them, and that it would probably happen late in the game, there was something that Coach Osborne said to his team that had nothing to do with blocking and tackling. It had nothing to do with X's and O's. This is what he said. Coach Osborne knew that Miami had players that loved to run their mouths. And he told his team this. He said, "One last thing. Now listen to me. I'll promise you this. If you guys will get your hands down, they're going to get a critical penalty at a time that's going to kill them. I mean, we do not want the dead ball foul. Do you understand that? I don't want anybody being a banty rooster. I don't want anyone pushing or shoving because there is going to be 2 flags and offsetting penalties. The thing that you guys can do to hurt those guys the most is to have the penalty walked off. You can't hurt a guy with all of this equipment on, so don't be pushing and mouthing. I don't want to see any more of that. Just play harder. The more they talk and the more stuff like that they do, the harder you play." Then he said, "Now listen, fellas, we're going for the national championship. You've got 30 minutes to get it done. Let's get it done. No excuses. This time we get it done." They were down in the third quarter, 17-7. Then it was 17-9, and then you'll remember Nebraska wins 24-17. One of Coach's players, after the game, said this: "Coach Osborne must have gotten a message from up above, because everything he said at halftime came true." And of all the things that changed the course of that game, it started with a leader, a coach, who demonstrated wisdom and discernment, and thankfully those he was leading were listening. Today, I want to talk about the impact of godly wisdom. Now, let me just say from the outset, this morning, we are talking about wisdom from God. Joseph was a man who demonstrated godly wisdom, godly discernment, and integrity. So much so that Pharaoh himself said this. He said to his servants back in Genesis chapter 41, he said this: "Can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are." So Pharaoh himself saw Joseph's wisdom as from God, and Joseph himself believed his wisdom was from God and that God was the one who was making him prosper. Now, I've heard of a number of definitions for wisdom over the years. Wisdom is the right use of knowledge, and I've heard others, but my favorite definition for wisdom is one I heard from our pastor in Chicago, and it is this: wisdom is the ability to choose the most God-honoring solution for any given situation. Wisdom is the ability to choose the most God-honoring solution for any given situation. And every single person sitting here today should desire to exercise godly wisdom in their lives, in our lives. So today we're going to talk about the impact of that. Now, last week we talked about the personal nature of God's providence. We talked about how Jacob and his family, remember, they packed up all their possessions and headed to Egypt, a strange land to them. You'll remember on their way to Egypt, they stopped in Beersheba, and Jacob stopped to worship there. He built an altar to worship and to wait on the Lord. And God spoke to Jacob in the night, and he said to him, I am God, the God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes. Now, we have to remember that God was not only bringing Jacob and his family to Egypt, God was also building a nation. That was what he was really doing. He was keeping his promise to Abraham. Then you'll remember what happened last week. We got to witness the wonderful reunion between Jacob and his son Joseph. With everybody standing around watching, the tears flowing, and the text says they wept on one another for a long time. But what can't get lost in this whole story that we are going through right now is we are still in the middle of a famine. In fact, the text tells us there's still 5 years left. There's still 5 years left of a famine. Now, I mentioned this before. Most of us have never lived through a famine. And what is at stake is life and death. Starvation is at stake. And guess who's in charge of everything going on in Egypt and making sure that everyone is okay? Joseph. He's in charge. Now, I want you this morning to think about the hardest job you have ever been asked to do in your life. And by hardest, I don't mean physical labor. What I mean is that which carried the most consequences, either good or bad, depending on your success in carrying out the job. Think of all the responsibility Joseph had on his shoulders, and think of what is at stake here. He's carrying the weight of, one, taking care of his family, who he'd just been reunited with, and his dad, whom he'd just been reunited with, as well as taking care of a whole nation. And why? Why was it so critical that he succeed? What was at stake? Life and death. That's what was at stake. Life and death for a whole nation. So turn with me, if you would, to Genesis chapter 46, and we're going to start in verse 31. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all they have with me. When Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. Now, we have to talk about context a lot today to understand what's going on here in this passage. To understand the significance of what Joseph is telling his brothers here, we have to remember some things about the culture in Egypt at the time. Jacob and his boys were shepherds, and they were a little rough around the edges, as we have seen, okay? They had not been exposed to those who had incredible political power. They also didn't understand Egyptian culture. Joseph, however, not only understood Egyptian culture, he also understood the power structure and how to excel as an outsider in the midst of the power structure. He's now ruling over all of Egypt. You see, Egypt itself was an isolated country. They kept themselves separate from other nations. Joseph understood that. They had a strong aversion to foreigners. Joseph respected it, and he didn't try to fight it. You remember what happened? You remember when Joseph invited his brothers in for a feast in his house? Remember how many tables there were set for the feast? There were 3. There was one table set for the Egyptians, one table for Joseph and one table for the brothers. Why was there three? Because the Egyptians considered themselves superior and wouldn't break bread with foreigners. They isolated themselves from strangers. And because Joseph knew that Egypt had a strong aversion to foreigners, he didn't want his brothers coming in and saying by their words and actions that they were going to impose their Hebrew culture on the Egyptians. Joseph knew that his brothers needed to defer to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was in charge, not them. He wants them to be a little bit more diplomatic, if you will, in their response to Pharaoh. They were the guests, and they needed to listen to and respect the culture. As Alan Ross points out, Joseph feared that the Egyptians would think of his family as unsettled nomads. And what Joseph is trying to do here with Pharaoh is Joseph wants to preserve his family's way of life, but in a manner that wouldn't offend Pharaoh. Now, there's an incredible amount of leadership and godly wisdom going on here in what Joseph is telling his brothers. He's preparing his family to enter a new land. Verse 1 of chapter 47, then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. He took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? So they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years of my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So after preparing his family, what does Joseph do? Joseph goes to Pharaoh. Now remember, friends, this is not a democracy going on in Egypt. This is a dictatorship. And he tells him that all his family and all their possessions are now in the land of Goshen. And he takes 5 of his brothers with him. And Pharaoh asked the brothers what their occupation was. And I'm sure Joseph just shook his head a little bit at his brother's response. But I appreciate just how Alan Ross points this out. He says, the brothers' straightforward answer, although slightly different from Joseph's advice, was intended to achieve what Joseph's advice wanted to achieve, and that was a separate life in the land of Goshen. Now, what we're going to have a hard time grasping this morning, and don't miss this, is how absolutely extraordinary Pharaoh's response to the brothers was. Remember, this is Egypt. This is a nation that lives separate from other nations. This is an isolated nation. Now, Pharaoh himself is inviting strangers from another country to move to Egypt, not just any part of Egypt, but the best land in Egypt that whole of Egypt had to offer. And oh, by the way, don't just move here, but I want you to take care of all my livestock too. You know, the brothers, you just walk through this whole story. Their minds had to be blown so many times when they started encountering Joseph. I mean, just think about this. The brothers went from foreigners in a strange land one day to watching Pharaoh's livestock the next day. God's providence at work. Now, we got to answer this question, though. Why would Pharaoh grant the brothers this privilege? Why would he let Jacob and his whole family live in the best land that Egypt had to offer? There's a simple answer to that. Joseph. Now listen, Pharaoh was no dummy. Pharaoh's like, listen, if these guys are anything like Joseph, guess what's going to happen to my livestock? It's going to flourish. If they have anything like the wisdom of their brother, any discernment like their brother, I'm going to be better off as well. God's providence is personal, and he works through people. In fact, and this is really important as we continue on our journey through Joseph's story here, the first part of Exodus is clear. When you turn the page to Exodus, the growth and prosperity of Egypt right now, here in Genesis, compared to Exodus, what's the difference? In Genesis, they had the blessing of God. So God is blessing Egypt, causing Egypt to flourish. Why? Because he's blessing Joseph and the nation of Israel. That's why. And Pharaoh was treating them well, was he not? He's inviting the nation into his own land and letting them flourish right there. And so what does God do? He blesses Pharaoh. But guess what? When you turn the page to Exodus and a new Pharaoh comes into power, a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, what does he do? He starts treating Israel harshly. And not only did he and the people of Egypt not prosper, they experienced destruction. They experienced the wrath of God, and guess what? Israel continued to flourish. I bring it up simply to point out that God was blessing Egypt because he was blessing Joseph and Israel. Pharaoh was treating them well, and as a result, everybody prospered. Which takes me all the way back to Genesis 12, verse 3. God told Abraham, "And I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you I will curse, and it's in you that all the families of the earth will be blessed." And that's being lived out right here in Genesis 47. Now, Pharaoh had to be eager to meet Joseph's father, Jacob. And so what happens? Jacob shows up, and the text says he blesses Pharaoh. Now this is significant because we need to remember something here about Jacob. As hard as we've been on Jacob in the past weeks, Jacob was the channel of divine blessing to the world. So when he's blessing Pharaoh, he's blessing him in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So think of this is in Pharaoh's presence when we read that Jacob is blessing Pharaoh. In the midst of a pagan land, Jacob's bringing his God into the picture. And I wonder what it was like for Jacob's family to hear Jacob say, "Few and unpleasant have been the days of my life." Jacob's life was not an easy one, would you agree? Much of that was to his own doing. His father Isaac died when he was 180 years old. His grandpa Abraham died when he was 175 years old. So by comparison, Jacob was a lot younger when he died. But now he would enjoy the last 17 years of his life with his whole family. God was good to Jacob. I'm going to say that again. In spite of the rascal that Jacob was, in spite of the duplicitous, deceitful nature which he exhibited a lot of his life, God was good to Jacob. Jacob blesses Pharaoh again, and they leave his presence. And I want to suggest to you that even the way Joseph handled this situation and this whole transition with his family into Egypt among the Egyptians who were worshipers of many gods and goddesses was a witness to the one true God. Verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones. Again, I mentioned this earlier. Think of all the weight that was on Joseph's shoulders. And I think we'd all agree that providing for your own family is one of the biggest weights we all carry, right? It's a huge responsibility, but he made sure his family was taken care of. Verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they had bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence, for our money is gone?" Then Joseph said, Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for their horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So the rest of this passage, starting here in verse 13, gives us insights into the challenges Joseph faced in his job as he ruled over Egypt, as well as the godly wisdom that he demonstrated in his ruling. The severity of the situation cannot be overstated. They'd run out of money. Verse 15 tells us that the people were completely at the mercy of Joseph. Whatever he decides is what's going to go, and their lives are completely in his hands. Joseph didn't just give them handouts. He didn't just put them on welfare. No, he continued to show them dignity and value. They brought him what they had in exchange for food. And guess what? This went on for a year. And then verse 18 says, when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your households, and as food for your little ones." So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." And Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Listen, Joseph did not have any prior history or a map that showed him the way on how to handle the situation. What does he do here? He uses godly wisdom and discernment and to figure out how to handle this situation. And I can't imagine the pressure on him. I mean, if any of you are in positions of leadership, think of what it would be like to know that you have everybody's lives is at stake depending on what you decide. Also, we know, and we regularly see this today in our world, when people are in positions of power, they can easily take advantage of situations to pad their own pockets. But Joseph didn't do that. He handles this with complete integrity, wisdom from God, discernment from God, integrity on display, so much so that the people's response to Joseph in verse 25 is what? You have saved our lives. It's hard for us to fathom the amount of respect that Joseph had from the people of Egypt and from Pharaoh himself. And I think it's safe to say that they all revered Joseph. Profound amount of respect for him. He saved them. He caused Pharaoh to prosper. And Joseph continued to realize that it was God who made him prosper. Had there ever been a point along the way where Joseph said, I am the guy? Think of how he could have acted to prop himself up. But you don't see that here. And then in verse 27 it says this, Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt and Goshen, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. God in his providence chose to work through a man named Joseph, and because of the godly wisdom demonstrated by Joseph, a country was saved and a nation was built. A country was saved and a nation was built because of the godly wisdom of one man. Verse 27 should remind all of us here this morning that God is a God of providence. He is the creator and sustainer of all things and is sovereignly at work accomplishing his purposes here on planet Earth through both good and challenging circumstances. When man tries to get in the way of his plans, he simply overrules. He had made a promise to Abraham. And verse 27 is evidence that he's keeping his promise. And with that, I come to our favorite two-word question. So what? So what? How does this passage apply to you and me? And I just have really two questions for us to wrestle through this morning, and I think they're important for us very practically in our daily living. The first one is this: do you care more about worldly wisdom or godly wisdom? Do you care more about worldly wisdom or godly wisdom? If you care about godly wisdom, are you pursuing it? Are you praying for it? Now, everybody hear this loud and clear, especially you young people. You can get all A's in school, you can get a perfect score on your ACT and still not have godly wisdom. You can be the president of your company, sit on boards of Fortune 500 companies, and be the smartest person in any room you walk into and still not have godly wisdom. I want to be very clear about something here this morning. Godly wisdom invites the blessing of God and thwarts the desires of the evil one. Godly wisdom invites the blessing of God and thwarts the desires of the evil one. And I just want to share with you a few verses in the Bible on wisdom. Proverbs 2, 6 and 7 says this: For the Lord gives wisdom. Who gives wisdom? Come on. Who gives wisdom? The Lord. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity. Colossians 2:3 says this about Jesus: in him, in Christ, are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. James 1:5 says, But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting. James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18 says this: Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitterness, bitter jealousy, and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And then 1 Corinthians 3, 18 through 20, Paul says this: take care that no one deceives himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, he must become foolish, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in the sight of God. For it is written, he is the one who catches the wise by their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are useless. Now, I just want to contrast here the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. Worldly wisdom exalts the servants. Godly wisdom exalts the Lord. Worldly wisdom builds on the wrong foundation with the wrong materials. Godly wisdom builds on the foundation of Jesus Christ and Him crucified while faithfully ministering the Word of God. Godly wisdom, I want to stress this, builds on the foundation of Jesus Christ. The foundation and the reality that we are sinners, that we could do nothing about our sin, and that Jesus came to this earth. He lived a perfect life, died a horrible death. Why? Because He loved us. He rose victoriously on the third day, conquering Satan, sin, and death. Without Him, we're done for. We're saved by grace through faith in Christ alone, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to His mercy He saves us. It is on that foundation, on the foundation of the person of Jesus Christ, that godly wisdom is built. Worldly wisdom is motivated by self-promotion. Godly wisdom is motivated by the glory of God. Let me say that again. Worldly wisdom is motivated by self-promotion. Godly wisdom is motivated by the glory of God. Godly wisdom realizes that prosperity comes from God alone, and as a result makes decisions to please Him. I just want you to think about your life right now. How many decisions do you make in a week? Think of how many decisions you have to make in a week, in a day, in a year, in a lifetime. How many choices do you have to make in a day? How many choices do you have to make in a week? How many choices do you have to make in a year? How many choices do you have to make in a lifetime? How many conversations are you in where you need some godly wisdom? I don't know about you, but in the midst of decisions that I have to make, in the midst of conversations that I'm in the midst of the choices that I have to make, I want to have the ability and I want to make the decision to choose the most God-honoring solution for any given situation. Do not underestimate the impact of godly wisdom. Which leads me to my second question this morning. Do I see the work God has given me to do as an avenue to impact the world? Do I see the work that God has given me to do as an avenue to impact the world? Joseph did something that hadn't been done before in Egypt. With great godly wisdom, he exemplified what? He exemplified creativity, compassion, ingenuity, and discernment to solve a national crisis. He knew God had a purpose for him, a plan for him, and he was faithful to do what God had called him to do. With excellence, by the way. You see, Joseph wasn't just working for Pharaoh, he was working for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as for the Lord, and not for men, Colossians 3:23. So your work, my work, whether it's in construction, as a teacher, as a lawyer, as a doctor, as a student, Whatever your work is an avenue in which we can demonstrate Christ to the world. See, I got news for you. Your work is a lot bigger than just you collecting a paycheck. You are Christ's representative at your work. And as you exercise godly wisdom, great impact can happen over time. We are ambassadors for Him. You see, when a person loves God and faithfully follows Him, demonstrating godly wisdom and a godly work ethic, that person is a bright, shining light in their workplace. You say, Matt, but all I feel is opposition in my work. Then your light's shining bright. That's a good sign. The presence of God in the lives of His people in the midst of a pagan world can have a profound impact. Let me just say that again. You realize when you go to work, because Christ is in you, the presence of God is there. The presence of God in the lives of His people in the midst of a pagan world can have a profound impact. Never underestimate the impact of one person who truly loves the Lord. Never underestimate the impact of a person who truly loves the Lord and demonstrates godly wisdom. Joseph demonstrated godly wisdom, and he walked by faith. And over time, what happened? Well, you had Pharaoh himself giving credit to God. A whole nation was impacted. You read the scriptures, think of the impact people not only like Joseph had, but what about Daniel? Again, taken as a youth, in the midst of a political power, and what happens? He testifies to the greatness of God. Talk about a bright, shining light. Or what about Nehemiah? Or what about Esther? Or what about Paul? Think of their impact on people. Think of their impact on nations. Their impact on people in positions of power, even. All because of their love for God and demonstration of godly wisdom. I'm telling you, where God has you is an avenue for you to impact the world for Him. I was reminded of this a few weeks ago. Gibbs' father passed away and was at his funeral, and I had a guy come up to me who I didn't recognize right away. And this happens to me often, and I get nervous when somebody says, "Are you Matt Shada?" Because I'm like, I'm supposed to know this person, but I don't know who they are. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I am Rick Schwartz. And then I immediately knew who this guy was. Well, think about this impact. Gibbs' father led Rick to the Lord. And when I was growing up in church, Rick worked in the construction business. And here's what I remember of Rick. I cannot tell you how many unsaved people Rick brought to church and led to the Lord. And so once he told me his name, I told him, I said, "Hey, I just want you to know, I talk about you at church." Because Rick saw his work as an avenue to impact the world. I think about, many of you know I went to the Moody Bible Institute. And there on the Moody Bible Institute campus, they have a small little, it's small, it's a small little museum dedicated to D.L. Moody. There's a statue of him and some other things where you can hear him speaking. But one of the neatest things in the museum is a sign that hangs above the door as you walk out. And it's a quote from Mr. Moody. And it says this: "When I am gone, I shall leave some grand men and women behind." Mr. Moody wasn't the most eloquent of speakers. He was a bit of a maverick. In fact, people called him Crazy Moody. But that man spoke to millions of people. He was a man who said, you know what, I want to be a person who sees what can happen if my life is fully devoted to the Lord. And I know what some of you are thinking, well, do I have to be a person who just stands up front? Or a person who is an eloquent speaker? No, you don't. This is one, I've seen this in my life. I mentioned my mom a few weeks ago. My mom is an introvert. But this happened to me a couple weeks ago. We were in Kearney for one of my son's tennis tournaments, and again, me, my daughter, and my wife, we go to Jimmy John's to get a quick bite to eat before the next match, and I'm walking up to get our food, and I hear this again. Matt Shada? And I had this time I really had no idea. And it's this lady, and I said, yeah? And she said, your mom and dad made a huge difference in my life. You see, it doesn't matter whether you're an extrovert, an introvert, whatever God has called you to do, wherever He has you. In fact, one of my favorite things that Paul says is in 2 Corinthians 3. This is what he says. The Corinthians are saying, hey, Paul, you don't have these letters of commendation. You don't have any letters about you, giving you credence of who you really are. And you know what Paul says to them? He says, hey, you Corinthians, guess what? You are our letter. Written on our hearts, known and read by all men. You see, Paul understood something. Paul understood that someday when he gets to heaven, he's not going to present his bank account to Jesus. He understood he's not going to present all his eloquence and how smart he was to Jesus. The one thing he was going to present to Jesus was people. And so he tells the Corinthians, you're it. You're my letter. And when people see you and how you live, they see my investment of the gospel of Jesus Christ in your life. When you go to work, when you go to school, whatever teams you're on, when you are doing whatever God calls you to do, I just want to say this. Joseph is an incredible example to us. You have an opportunity to make a mighty difference for Jesus over time as you exercise godly wisdom and faithfully follow the Lord. Are we together? Let's pray. And Lord, I'm sure this morning there's some of us who are weary with our work, weary with our boss. Some of us who are just going to work, collecting a paycheck, or just going to school. We're bored with school, tired of school. And I just pray that you would help us to see what you have given us to do as a lot bigger than just a task or collecting a paycheck, but as an avenue to impact the world for you. Thanks for the example of Joseph, and I pray that every single person here would pursue godly wisdom, for you're worthy of it. Let's stand and sing this last song together.